It was a bright and busy morning in London. People from all around the world gathered at Buckingham Palace, excited to watch the famous changing of the guard ceremony. The sun shone down on the grand gates, and tourists clicked pictures, chatting and laughing, enjoying their visit to the heart of British tradition. Among them was a black royal guardsman, standing tall and proud in his red uniform, wearing the iconic bearskin hat. He had a job to do, one that required focus and strength. He was part of the proud tradition of the British Army, serving the monarchy with discipline and honor. His role as a guardsman wasn't just about standing still in his uniform. It was about representing the values of the British Army, maintaining composure in the face of distractions, and enduring long hours without showing any sign of weakness. But despite the public admiration for the guards, not all tourists understood the deep respect and history behind the ceremony. Some came to witness the moment out of curiosity, while others showed little interest in the significance. For the guardsman, this day was no different from the others. He stood motionless, his gaze fixed straight ahead, his mind clear. Nothing, no amount of noise, laughter, or flashes from cameras, would make him break his focus. It was this commitment that had earned him the respect of his fellow soldiers and the admiration of the public. As the tourists moved around the palace, some stopped to admire the guardsman. They knew he was a part of something much larger than himself, part of a long tradition that had lasted for centuries. They respected the effort it took to remain still and disciplined for hours on end, especially in such a busy and noisy place. However, not everyone had the same level of understanding. Some visitors were simply there to take a picture or to poke fun at the guards, treating them as if they were just a part of the tourist attraction. The guardsman had faced his share of disrespect over the years, but he had learned not to let it bother him. He would stand still, his posture perfect, no matter what people said or did. That day, however, things would be different. The atmosphere around him began to change. A tourist, with a large group of people in tow, appeared to be walking toward him, a wide grin across his face. This person seemed eager to get closer to the guards and was already making loud, joking comments. The group of friends around him laughed, but the guardsman didn't flinch. He had been trained for this. Nothing would make him lose his cool. But this tourist wasn't just taking pictures or making innocent jokes. His tone grew more disrespectful as he approached the guardsman. He began making pointed comments about the guardsman's appearance, his uniform, and even his heritage. He didn't seem to realize the weight of his words. The crowd surrounding them started to notice. Some turned away uncomfortably, while others whispered amongst themselves. The guardsman's posture remained perfect, but inside, his mind remained focused on his duty. He couldn't afford to let the disrespect distract him. Still, something about this tourist's behavior felt different. It wasn't just the usual curiosity or joking around. There was something sharper in the words, something that went beyond a simple misunderstanding. What would happen next? No one could predict. The tourist, clearly enjoying the attention of his group, walked even closer to the guardsman, his words growing louder. He made sure to stand right in front of him, almost as if he was trying to provoke some kind of reaction. His friends, standing behind him, giggled, thinking it was all part of the fun. But the guardsman remained unmoved, his face expressionless, as he had been trained to do. He didn't acknowledge the tourist at all, even when the mocking comments began to edge into more personal territory. "Look at you," the tourist said, snickering. "Just standing there, like a robot. Is this what you do for a living?" His tone wasn't playful anymore. It was more pointed, as if he was trying to make the guardsman feel small. The others around him watched, some still smiling, not fully understanding the seriousness of the situation. After all, they had seen similar scenes before with other guards, and nothing ever seemed to happen. But this time, something felt different. The guardsman's unwavering stance made it clear that he was not going to let the comments slide. The tourists laughed again, thinking it was just a joke, but the guardsman didn't budge. His hands were firmly gripping his rifle, and his eyes remained straight ahead. He had been in situations like this before, where tourists tried to get a reaction out of him. But he had learned that showing any emotion, any sign of distraction, would only encourage more disrespect. And so he held his ground, standing tall and silent. But the tourist wasn't finished. He stepped closer, now reaching out to tap the guardsman's shoulder, as if daring him to react. "Why so serious? Come on, show some personality," the tourist teased, leaning in even closer. His friends giggled again, but there was a shift in the air. Other people nearby began to notice the tension, sensing that this wasn't just an innocent joke anymore. Some of the bystanders started to feel uneasy, realizing that the tourist was pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable. But the guardsman's focus remained absolute. He was a soldier first and foremost, and his duty to his post was above everything else. Nothing, no matter how annoying or disrespectful, was going to make him lose control. For a brief moment, the crowd seemed to hold its breath. It was clear that the tourist wasn't going to stop his taunts, and the guardsman wasn't going to break his silence. The situation was becoming more uncomfortable by the second, but the guardsman didn't show any sign of wavering. He was a professional. His job was to protect, to stand firm, and to endure whatever challenges came his way. But the tourist's actions were starting to cross a line, and it was clear that this moment wasn't going to end with just another picture and a few laughs. The noise around them seemed to fade into the background. The other tourists and passers-by began to whisper amongst themselves, exchanging nervous glances. It was as if everyone could sense that something was about to change. The guardsman knew that he couldn't just let the tourist's actions slide forever. His patience, honed through years of training, had its limits. It was clear that this tourist had underestimated the strength and dignity of the man in front of him. And soon, he would realize that disrespecting the guardsman came with consequences. As the tourist stepped closer, the guardsman could feel the pressure mounting. He was used to dealing with difficult situations, but this one felt different. The tourist's persistence was becoming more than just a harmless joke. It was now a direct challenge to his professionalism. The bystanders were now fully aware of what was happening, and their uneasy glances only added to the growing tension. Some of them were hoping the guardsman would remain calm, as he always had, but there was a sense that things were getting out of hand. Without warning, the tourist reached out and placed a hand on the guardsman's shoulder. This bold move pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable, and for the first time, the guardsman's muscles tensed. His training had taught him to remain still and unflinching, no matter what happened around him. But this was not just a harmless touch, it was a clear sign of disrespect. The guardsman's eyes flickered, and in that moment, the crowd could see the change in his posture. The usual calm was replaced by a sudden alertness, a readiness that hinted at the strength beneath his disciplined exterior. With a swift, practiced movement, the guardsman stepped aside, pivoting on his heels, his posture still impeccable. He reached out and grabbed the tourist's wrist, firmly but without hesitation. The action was so fast, so controlled, that it caught everyone by surprise. The tourist, who had expected to get away with his behavior, was now the one taken aback. He tried to pull his hand back, but the guardsman's grip was strong, unyielding. The tourist's initial shock quickly turned into confusion. He had never expected the guardsman to react this way, let alone with such force and control. He thought he could keep pushing, keep taunting without any consequence. But in that instant, he realized he had miscalculated. The crowd fell silent. People who had been recording the event now lowered their phones, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. They watched closely, waiting to see what would happen next. The guardsman, still holding the tourist's wrist, locked eyes with him. His gaze was steady, his face still impassive, but there was a clear message in his eyes. This was not a game. He was not going to tolerate any more disrespect. With a calm but firm voice, the guardsman spoke, breaking his silence for the first time. "That's enough," he said, his words cutting through the air. "Leave now." The tone was not angry, but resolute. There was no room for argument, no tolerance for further disrespect. The tourist, now realizing the seriousness of the situation, stood frozen for a moment. His mind raced as he tried to comprehend what was happening. He had expected laughter, maybe a scolding, but not this. He had pushed too far, and now he was faced with the reality of his actions. The guardsman released his wrist, taking a step back, but his eyes never left the tourist. The tourist hesitated, unsure of what to do next. He looked around at the onlookers, who were now watching him with disapproving expressions. His bravado had vanished, replaced by a sense of embarrassment. He opened his mouth, likely to offer an excuse or try to justify his actions, but the guardsman's calm authority made it clear that there was nothing left to say. The tourist slowly stepped back, muttering under his breath, but the guardsman didn't move an inch. He was still standing tall, unwavering, and despite the tourist's retreat, he never let his guard down. The crowd, once tense, began to relax. Some of them exchanged looks of surprise, while others seemed to nod in silent approval. It was clear that the guardsman had not only protected his dignity, but had also earned the respect of everyone witnessing the moment. What had begun as an uncomfortable encounter had turned into a quiet lesson in strength, professionalism, and the power of standing your ground. The tourist, still caught off guard by the guardsman's unexpected response, stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He had expected the usual. The guard would remain frozen, unaffected by his teasing and mocking comments. But now, he was facing the reality that his actions had consequences. He glanced around, feeling the weight of the stares from the growing crowd of onlookers. The laughter and light-hearted chatter that had filled the air just moments ago had now fallen silent, replaced by an uneasy tension. He had thought of the guardsman as a mere figure to be played with, but now, standing in front of him, he realized the guard was far more than just a statue in a uniform. The guardsman, with a calm and composed demeanor, stood perfectly still. He had given the tourist a clear warning. There was no more tolerance for his behavior. Yet he wasn't aggressive, and there was no hint of anger in his actions. The strength of the moment lay in the quiet authority that the guardsman exuded. His stance remained impeccable, and his eyes, though steady, carried a certain power that made it clear he would not tolerate disrespect, no matter the source. The guardsman wasn't looking for a confrontation. He was simply doing his job, fulfilling his duty with professionalism, which made the tourist's behavior seem all the more out of place. The tourist, who had prided himself on being the center of attention, now found himself shrinking under the quiet intensity of the guardsman. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, feeling the uncomfortable realization that everyone around him had seen the entire exchange. His bravado had evaporated, leaving only confusion and embarrassment. His group of friends, who had been laughing just moments before, were now strangely quiet, unsure of what to say. They had expected a fun interaction, maybe a funny photo opportunity, but not this. They looked at the tourist, then at the guardsman, and some of them began to exchange uneasy glances. It was as if they were seeing the situation from a new perspective now that the tone had changed. The guardsman didn't break his gaze. He didn't need to. His silent presence spoke volumes. With one final glance at the tourist, the guardsman turned his attention back to his post. He had done what was necessary, and now it was time to return to his duty. It was as if the moment had never happened at all. He resumed his stiff, unyielding posture, standing tall and proud as though he were a part of the very palace itself. The tourist, now realizing there was no escape from his own discomfort, began to back away, slowly at first, then more quickly. His friends followed, casting quick, embarrassed looks over their shoulders as they moved away from the scene. For a moment, the scene felt frozen in time. The guardsman remained immovable, as the world around him continued to bustle with activity. The tourist group finally disappeared into the crowd, their laughter replaced with murmurs of conversation. The onlookers who had been watching now began to discuss what they had just witnessed. Some were in awe of the guardsman's response, admiring his strength and composure. Others were shaking their heads, realizing how inappropriate the tourists' actions had been in the first place. The crowd's mood had shifted. No one was laughing now. What had begun as a light-hearted moment had turned into a reflection of respect and dignity. Despite the tense moment, the guardsman showed no sign of feeling any different. His job was the same as it had been before. The weight of tradition and responsibility still rested on his shoulders. He had faced down disrespect and stood firm. But as he stood there, silent and composed, there was a quiet sense of pride in his actions. He hadn't needed to raise his voice or show anger. His mere presence had been enough to put the tourist in his place. And as he stood, still and strong, he knew that his response had sent a powerful message, not just to the tourist, but to everyone who had witnessed the moment. The crowd, which had been murmuring just moments before, seemed to pause and reflect on what had just happened. Some of the tourists, who had been too busy snapping photos or chatting, now understood the gravity of the situation. The guardsman had done something that no one had expected. He had calmly and assertively stood up to the disrespect, without raising his voice or showing any sign of anger. It was a quiet kind of strength, one that seemed to make everyone around him rethink the way they viewed the role of the guards. The tourist, on the other hand, was no longer laughing or boasting. His earlier confidence had completely disappeared, replaced by an awkward silence. He had walked into the scene thinking he could get away with some harmless teasing. But now, as he and his group of friends made their way back through the crowd, the weight of his actions was finally sinking in. He had expected a joke, a funny interaction to tell his friends about later. Instead, he had been shown the true meaning of respect and dignity. There was no playful back and forth in this situation. It was clear that the guardsman wasn't just a figure to be mocked or laughed at. He was a professional, someone who stood for more than just tradition. He represented strength, discipline, and a deep sense of pride in his work. As the tourist walked away, his eyes darted around, but there was no escaping the feeling of being judged. The bystanders, once entertained by the playful mood, were now speaking in hushed tones, discussing what had just transpired. Some had taken out their phones again, capturing the moment as the tourist slowly disappeared into the crowd. The moment of tension had passed, but its impact lingered in the air. The guardsman, ever the professional, didn't acknowledge the shift in the crowd's mood. He remained perfectly still, his gaze forward, as if nothing had happened. But to those who had witnessed the exchange, it was clear that the guardsman's reaction had been a powerful lesson in self-control and dignity. The group of friends who had been with the tourist now seemed unsure of how to proceed. They looked at each other, some with sheepish expressions, others with a hint of guilt. They had followed the tourist's lead, laughing at his jokes and encouraging his behavior, but now they realized how out of place it all had been. There was an awkwardness in the air, and some of them avoided eye contact with the guardsman as they walked past him. None of them said a word to him, and they quickly blended back into the crowd, hoping to put the uncomfortable moment behind them. Meanwhile, the rest of the crowd seemed to recover from the tension, but the incident had left an impression on many of them. Some whispered to each other, talking about the calm but firm way the guardsman had handled the situation. Others commented on how the tourist had misjudged the situation and how quickly he had realized his mistake. It was a moment that had shifted the mood of the day, turning what was once a simple tourist attraction into a powerful reminder of respect, authority, and self-respect. But as the minutes passed, the guardsman remained unchanged. His posture was still, his attention unwavering. He had done what was necessary. He had shown the strength to stand firm in the face of disrespect, and in doing so, had sent a clear message to everyone around him. There was no need for further confrontation. The lesson had already been learned. The guardsman had not only protected himself from the disrespect, but had also protected the honor of the tradition he represented. The crowd slowly returned to its usual rhythm, the moment now a memory. But for many, the powerful example set by the guardsman would stay with them for much longer. As the tourist group disappeared into the crowd, The atmosphere around Buckingham Palace slowly returned to its usual hum. People resumed snapping photos, chatting, and enjoying the iconic sights of the city. Yet for many, the powerful moment with the Guardsman lingered in their minds. The usual excitement of the ceremony had been replaced by a sense of quiet reflection, as visitors found themselves thinking more deeply about the traditions they had come to witness. Some tourists, still processing what had just happened, glanced back at the Guardsman standing so resolutely at his post. They had seen the interaction unfold from a distance, and were now left to wonder about the deeper meaning behind the silent strength that had just been demonstrated. The Guardsman had done more than just stand still. He had shown that dignity and respect were not to be taken for granted. It was clear now that there was much more to being a royal guardsman than simply wearing a uniform. He wasn't just an object to be admired or a figure to be joked with. He was a person who carried a rich history and purpose. And in that moment, he had quietly, but firmly, reminded everyone of that. Among the crowd, there were a few who began to discuss the situation. Some were astonished by how calmly the Guardsman had handled the entire encounter. They admired his ability to maintain control without losing his composure. Others, especially those who had witnessed the tourists' behavior firsthand, now felt a sense of unease about how the situation had unfolded. Many of them hadn't realized the level of disrespect that had been shown until the tourist had crossed the line. They began to understand that it wasn't just about teasing the guard. It was about the larger picture of respecting the role he played and the history he represented. The incident had reminded them of the importance of honoring the individuals who were part of a long tradition, not only in the United Kingdom but around the world. The Guardsman, meanwhile, remained steady at his post, never wavering. He had already done what needed to be done, and now it was time to return to the task at hand. He was a part of something bigger than any single moment or individual. His job was not just about standing guard. It was about representing the values of the British military and upholding a tradition that had been passed down for centuries. He had faced adversity and handled it with quiet dignity, staying true to his training and his mission. And as the day went on, he continued to stand, undisturbed, as people moved about, each of them likely thinking about the interaction in their own way. For some, the incident would fade into the background, just another moment during their vacation. But for others, it would serve as a reminder of the strength that lies in self-discipline and the importance of respect in every situation. The Guardsman's composed reaction had left an impression that wasn't easy to forget. The tourists who had witnessed the exchange, whether they were directly involved or not, now carried with them a lesson in how powerful restraint and professionalism could be. It wasn't about the Guardsman's ability to fight back or engage in confrontation. It was about how he had stood firm in the face of disrespect and maintained his dignity without saying a word. As the day wore on, the palace grounds slowly started to empty, with many people continuing to move on to their next destination. Yet the moment with the Guardsman stayed in the back of their minds, serving as a reminder of the importance of respect in even the most casual encounters. Some people would tell their friends and family about what had happened, sharing the story of the Guardsman who didn't flinch in the face of provocation. Others, perhaps, would take a more personal lesson from the encounter, remembering how strength and composure could make an impact, even in the most unexpected of situations. As the day continued, the crowd at Buckingham Palace shifted with the flow of visitors coming and going. Some who had witnessed the tense encounter between the tourist and the Guardsman remained, still quietly reflecting on what they had seen. Others, unaware of what had happened earlier, continued taking pictures and admiring the Grand Palace as if nothing unusual had taken place. But for those who had watched closely, the image of the unshaken Guardsman remained fresh in their minds. The tourist, now walking further away with his friends, still felt uneasy. His earlier excitement had faded, replaced by a sense of embarrassment that he couldn't quite shake off. He had thought the moment would be funny, something to brag about later, but instead, it had left him feeling exposed. His friends, who had initially laughed and cheered him on, were now quiet. They hadn't expected things to turn out the way they did. Some of them looked at him with uncertainty, as if questioning whether they had been wrong to encourage him. One of them finally spoke up. "You really shouldn't have done that," one of the friends muttered, glancing back toward the guardsman. The tourist didn't respond right away. He wasn't used to feeling regret about his actions, but there was something about the way the guardsman had reacted, or rather, how he had not reacted, that left a mark on him. He had expected resistance, or maybe even anger, but what he got instead was quiet strength and dignity. That was what made it so unsettling. There was no big argument, no dramatic confrontation. Just a firm, silent message that spoke louder than any words could. As they walked further away, the tourist couldn't help but check his phone. He had seen other people recording the moment, and a part of him feared that the video would spread. If it did, it wouldn't be a proud moment for him. It would be a reminder of how he had been humbled in front of a crowd. He didn't want to admit it, but deep down, he knew he had been wrong. Meanwhile, back at the palace, the guardsman continued his duty as if nothing had happened. His focus never wavered, his posture never weakened. His job was more than just standing still. He was a symbol of discipline and honor. He knew moments like these would happen from time to time, but he had been trained for them. His role was not to react emotionally, but to uphold his duty with professionalism. And that's exactly what he had done. Some of the bystanders who had been watching earlier now had a newfound respect for the guardsman. A few even approached the area again, standing at a respectful distance to take photos, not of the palace, but of the guardsman himself. They wanted to capture not just an image but a lesson, a reminder of the power of self-control and dignity in the face of disrespect. As the sun began to set, the incident slowly became just another moment in the day. The tourists moved on. The crowd changed, and soon the palace grounds were filled with a different set of visitors who had no idea what had happened. But for those who had witnessed it, the lesson remained. True strength is not about fighting back with anger, but standing firm with dignity. And that was exactly what the guardsman had done. As the day drew to a close, the sun dipping low in the sky and casting long shadows across the courtyard, the event seemed to settle into the background. People continued to visit Buckingham Palace, some taking one last stroll through the grounds, others stopping by for a quick photo. The hustle and bustle of the tourist-filled area continued as normal, yet there was a quiet undercurrent to the day now, a shift in how people viewed the royal guardsman. Many of the onlookers who had witnessed the earlier exchange with the tourist began to reflect on the incident. Some of them spoke to each other in quiet tones, discussing how calmly the guardsman had handled the situation. They realized that what had seemed like a simple, everyday interaction was actually much more significant. The guardsman hadn't just stood at his post in silence. He had taken a moment that could have escalated into a confrontation and turned it into a quiet demonstration of respect and professionalism. There was something powerful about how he had handled the disrespect without raising his voice or getting involved in a verbal dispute. In the days that followed, some of the tourists who had seen the exchange found themselves sharing the story with their friends and family. They didn't just talk about what had happened, they talked about the lesson they had learned. One of the tourists, who had initially found the situation awkward, later reflected on how important it was to show respect to others, no matter their position or role. They realized that the guardsman was not just standing there for decoration. He was a symbol of history, tradition, and service. What had started as a trivial moment of teasing had transformed into a profound reminder of the values that bind people together. Meanwhile, the tourist who had started the whole interaction also came to terms with what had happened. He had spent a few days feeling embarrassed, but as he thought about it more, he came to respect the guardsman's strength. The reaction he had received wasn't the one he had expected, but it was exactly what he needed. It wasn't easy for him to admit, but in hindsight, he realized how wrong his actions had been. The moment of humiliation had been the result of his own ignorance, and he now understood that real strength wasn't in being disrespectful or trying to provoke someone. It was in maintaining composure and dignity, no matter the circumstances. By the time the incident had started to fade from memory, It had made a lasting impact on those who had seen it. It wasn't just about the Guardsman's actions. It was about how people reacted to them. It was about the quiet strength that often goes unnoticed in everyday life, the kind of strength that doesn't need to be loud or attention-grabbing to be powerful. The tourists, the bystanders, and even the guards themselves had learned something important that day. Sometimes, strength is most effective when it's wielded with calm, not force. And in the case of the Royal Guardsman, that lesson was taught with nothing more than the quiet authority of standing tall and firm in the face of disrespect. In the end, what seemed like a simple interaction had turned into something far more meaningful. People had walked away with a new understanding of respect, dignity, and strength, and even the tourist who had made the mistake left with a more profound lesson than he could have imagined. The Guardsman's presence at Buckingham Palace was never just about guarding the grounds. It was about guarding a tradition, and in that moment, he had shown that tradition is not just about standing still. It's about standing for something greater than oneself. And that's a lesson that would stay with everyone who had witnessed it for a long time to come.